Welcome, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be with you all here in this last webinar of a series of our Artivism Fellowship. And a shout out to our four fellows. And you saw the PowerPoint introducing our four fellows that participated in this first cohort of the program: Mercedes Pineda, Ariana Cruz, Cecilia Moreno, and Maria Torres. Shout out to them. They did an extraordinary job. And we're going to close this series of speakers with this webinar on the history of the Chicano movement with Dr. Lea Ybarra. I think that we're living through some very historical times. Everywhere we look around them with political transition, with the global pandemic, with the series of economic crises that we're living, it it reminds me of the importance of the Chicano movement. It reminds me also of the importance of the legacy of that movement in shaping our contemporary politics, and also in trying to understand the legacy that he had, the impact that he had on empowering our communities, the legacy that he had also on empowering and visibilizing the role of women, and also, most importantly, in imagining different alternatives, educational alternatives, economic activities for our communities. So what are the lessons that we can draw from that amazing civil rights movement of the 1960s, and what are the lessons that we can draw to the present? So with us for this conversation, we have Dr. Lea Ybarra. Let's welcome her. Dr. Lea Ybarra received her doctorate at UC Berkeley in the Bay Area. So I guess it wasn't that far, right, from Fresno to Berkeley. But she did also graduate work at Stanford and postgraduate work at Harvard University. And over the years, she's done work at Fresno State and also in the East Coast at Johns Hopkins University, where she stayed for a while in directing the Center for Talented Youth program. And that program was very important because it identified and provided academic programs to highly gifted students. She's a recipient of many, many awards for her teaching, research, and community service. And also, her research have included topics in education, family, and gender issues, also immigration and peace and conflict studies. So she really brings with her broad scope of expertise and reflections. Among her many publications include the book and film Americanos, which I use for my class, Latino Life in the United States. And that was uh, written and co-produced with Edward James Olmos. And also her latest book is Vietnam Veteranos, Chicanos Recall the War. So help me welcome Dr. Lea Ybarra. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I
So
appreciate it.
thank you. And just thinking about your long experience, I think, and just talking to, I wonder what challenges you have in talking to new generations of Chicanas and Chicanos who are experiencing a new reality. Um, Now there's a lot of discussion again about how, what should we call ourselves?
Yeah.
Latinos, Hispanics, Latinx. Uh, can you talk a little bit and remind us what do you think is the historical importance of the Chicano movement of the 1960s and how it has influenced how we view ourselves, how we organize ourselves, and how it shapes the struggle that we currently are facing in the United States?
Okay. Well, thank you for the question. I'd like to thank Mirna for inviting me here. I appreciate that. And then also congratulate the fellows who are graduating from the program. I think probably one of the biggest issues that I face, because I've been a professor for 45 years, that I just retired recently from Johns Hopkins. And most students do not know what the Chicano movement was, what it did, and the fact that the progress that we've made was really based on that. So I think there's three or four impetus for the Chicano movement. But before I get into that, I want to make sure that people understand that that was not the beginning of the struggle of Chicanos and Mexicanos and other Latinos in this area. For example, even beginning with the labor struggles, there were protests and strikes and boycotts here in, in the Valley, in little towns like Pixley and Parlier and so forth, as early as the 1930s. And also in education with the Westminster versus Mendes versus Westminster case, where they were fighting against segregation in the schools because Mexican kids, even if they spoke English, were being segregated into other schools. So you had that issue in certainly in farm labor, in education, and even further back than that, in the early 1800s, where you had individuals like Tiburcio Vasquez and Joaquin Murrieta, who were considered bandidos by the US, but heroes by our communities, because they fought things like the land being taken away from the Mexicanos, and they fought lynchings. I mean, most students are very surprised to know that just the way Blacks were lynched in the South, many Mexican Americans and Mexicanos were lynched in the Southwest. And for a certain period in the 1800s, there were lynchings of Mexicanos every single day. So there's always been a struggle for fighting for our justice, for our equal rights, and for the kinds of things, excuse me, that we need to better ourselves and to get dignity in this country. And certainly we can't forget organizations like the GI Forum, that after World War II, Mexicanos were coming back, and they got started because Mexicanos who died in World War II were not allowed to be buried in their hometowns because the cemeteries were segregated. And so that was certainly an assault to our dignity. And also Mexicanos, even in uniform, were not allowed to go into stores and theaters and so forth. So the GI Forum fought for those rights as well. So way back into the 1800s to the 1930s to the 1940s, and certainly up into the 60s, we've always struggled and fought for our rights as citizens in this country. Because as you remember, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1948 guaranteed that all Mexicanos who stayed on this side of the border or were living on this side of the border would become American citizens with all the rights of American citizens. But yet our history tells another story, unfortunately. So now that sort of laid that background that in fact our struggles have always been here, I'd like to get into what the Chicano movement was, because the Chicano movement, as I mentioned, was not born in a vacuum. We had all these struggles before it. The difference was now that we had thousands in our communities joining forces in what was the Chicano movement. It was really the first time that we had a unified effort beyond just labor, people, fighting for labor, education, fighting for education. It was really across the community in terms of individuals trying to do what they could to better our circumstances. So I guess to me, there was a lot of impetus for the movement, but to me, the main ones were the times we're living in. In the 1960s, you had Martin Luther King, you had the civil rights movement, the Blacks saying, that certainly fighting against the words that they were being called and fighting for their dignity. You had women fighting for their rights. You had Asians, you had Native Americans. So really, there was a real awakening in this country of our rights, and the Chicano movement just sort of fed right into that and grew from that, because they also said our identity is not, when Mexican Americans was a word that was always used, and it's still used because it tried to identify Mexicanos that were born in this country, to let people know that not everyone comes across every day, that people have been coming across every day, but the way we look at it is once they cross the border, they're Americanos and they're Mexican Americans here. And so they tried to say we're not split between one or the other. Our full identity is as a Chicano, with our Aztec and Mayan roots, and with our culture also here in the United States that we've developed. And so it was really a natural part of trying to be a part of that. And one of the things too that I think people may not be aware of is just the way the Black Lives Matter movement, where you saw like all kinds of faces and ages and colors in that march. You saw that during this time as well, because you saw the marches and it was full of all people of different colors and races, because we all had the same goals. We're fighting for equality. We're fighting for a more relevant curriculum and all kinds of things that I'll mention in a minute. So I think that the times were right for the Chicano movement to also expand. And just the way you had the Black Panthers, you had in the Chicanos, the Brown Berets, and there was always equivalence from one to the other. So it was a very active movement. And I think another reason that it was also possible was that this movement grew out of the universities. And for the first time, we had a large enough contingent of Chicanos and other Latinos in universities to make a difference, to be able to go out there and do those things. Another impetus that really couldn't be removed from the Chicano movement at that time was the United Farm Workers movement. Cesar Chavez, I remember, I was a student at Fresno State at the time. I was here as a freshman, then transferred to UC Berkeley as a sophomore. But I remember in that first year, he started his march to go from Delano to Sacramento. And he had also put out a call to all students. So there was like thousands of us that joined him in Coachella. And he said students need to be involved in the movement, in the United Farm Workers. And so that was an integral part, I think, of the Chicano movement as a whole. I remember the first marches that came, and you sort of started thinking, I can talk about Fresno State, and some of the students are in this area. I remember being there and Chavez coming with his workers to speak, and the ag students were throwing grapes at Chavez and the farm workers. They had bought their box of grapes and were throwing it at them because we, of course, had the grape boycott. So it was those kinds of struggles. I also remember that when he called students to participate, a lot of us did. I had transferred to Berkeley when he started the other activities like the strikes and so forth. And I remember coming down in the summertime and participating in the organizing. And when you think about that every worker has the right to organize, when it came to the United Farm Workers, the growers didn't want them to organize or to have a union. So I remember going out into the fields with my colleagues and having dogs sicked at us. I had a gun put to my head by one of the farmers saying, if you didn't get the F out of here, I'm going to shoot you. So, and I was one of many people that had those things. If everyone has a chance to see a film like Fighting for Our Lives, for example, that shows how much Mexicanos were beaten up and the farm workers were thrown in jail and so forth, which is another experience that I had. One day we were all rounded up. We were striking out in the fields on the road, so we weren't on the property of the landowner. But again, to see the kinds of things, the way law has been used against us. They had said the rancher got an injunction in the courts to say that we had to be 60 feet from one side of the road and 60 feet from the other side of the road. Well, if everybody knows those little narrow roads, it's like one of the people in the film Fighting for Our Life says, that would put us somewhere up in the air. So because they got the injunction, though, even though it was our constitutional right to protest, and it was a peaceful protest, because, Chavez really believed in nonviolent protest. What happened then was that they jailed us. They rounded up 600 women, over 1,000 men. They put the women in the county jail and the men in the Fresno City jail. My brother was striking too, so he got picked up. And so my parents had to visit me in the county jail, my brother in the city jail, and my sister was a student at San Francisco State at the time. She was on a hunger strike there with other students. And we just our family, I think, mirrored what was going on in so many families around the Southwest. But a tribute to my parents, they never said, don't do it. They always told us, I'm proud of you for standing up for your rights. We need to do this. And so they really supported us quite a bit. So they were certainly, the farm workers was an integral part of the movement. And the last thing I'd like to talk in terms of the impetus was the Vietnam War. Just the way the UFW was integral to the Chicano movement, the Vietnam War was too. For any of us that were Chicanos, you were also against the Vietnam War, because Dr. Ralph Guzman from UC Santa Cruz had issued a report that talked about how even though we represented a small percentage at that time of Latinos in this country, we were killed by a much higher percentage. So at the time he wrote his report, over 10,000 Chicanos had been killed in the Vietnam War. And one of the things that happened then was that sort of lit the match for us to also say, we're cannon fodder. It was the minorities, it was the poor, because at that time you had college deferment. So those that had college education or were in college, which not that many of us were, got deferments. Those that were not in college got drafted. And so many of our young men got, because at that point they weren't drafting women, many of our young men got drafted and many got killed in Vietnam. And that's one of the reasons that I wrote the book. I'm going to be sort of going down a bit, Vietnam Veteranos, because one of the things about it was that I saw that with all the sacrifices that our people had made in the wars, and all the wars, beginning from the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, we had never been given our credit. So I saw these films coming out. I saw all these testimonials coming out, and I thought, where are the Mexicanos? I mean, look at how many of our people got killed, and their stories hadn't been told. So it was one of the first books called Vietnam Veteranos, Chicanos Recall the War. And it was really very heartfelt stories from these veterans. And I'm glad to say that there's now quite a few books on Chicanos in Vietnam and in the wars, because I think we recognize that if we don't tell our own stories, nobody's going to tell our stories. So again, that was one of the things that was really important, was the Vietnam marches, because we all participated in that. And we got trained as draft counselors. So we'd go to the base, to the draft training centers where they're recruiting the people, and talk to Chicanos and say, do you understand what's going on here? And we had a booklet called La Batalla Está Aquí, the war is here. It's like you're fighting people over there when we don't get the respect and the dignity that we deserve here. So I think that was another part that was very important part of the Chicano movement. I can stop here, or I can go on and talk about why don't I stop there so we can talk about it?
Thank you,
Because the
Dr.
next thing I would like to mention is the demands that came out of that. But, okay, but
Great.
You might have some
and
questions.
also, my apologies because I skipped a very important part of the agenda. So I want to welcome Cecilia Moreno, fellow of the program, who will do land acknowledgement. Please, Cecilia, and forgive me for skipping that part.
Oh, no worries, Dr. Squad. No problems at all. But hi, everyone. My name is Cecilia Moreno. I am one of the fellows. I'm located in Merced, California, but I'm actually from Rosita, California, since that's in Tulare County. But I wanted to take a minute just to do a land acknowledgement, just to let you guys know. I did put a link in the chat in the very beginning asking if you guys have a chance to go to this website and then enter the location where you're at, and it will tell you what indigenous land or native land you are at. So for me, I'm in Merced, or even in Tulare, I'm on Yokut land. But just to let you know, like, we're on Native American land here in the Central Valley. I am Native American and also Mexican, but the native people that I am is from the Tachi and Wachami people, the Yoka people here in the Central Valley. You know, we play a big part here. So I do a lot of stuff with my Native American tribe and trying to help revitalize our language and our cultures. So that's just a little bit about me on that one. So thank you again for allowing me to do the land acknowledgement.
Thank you, Cecilia. And now I'd like to invite Mercedes Pineda to provide us with a description of the Artivism Fellowship. Go ahead, Mercedes.
Hello, I'm Mercedes Meche, she, they. So I want to share with y'all a description that we came up with. So the fellowship was designed in partnership with Pan Valley Institute and Fresno State's College of Arts and Humanities and the Department of Theater and Dance, specifically for Latinx and Indigenous youth, to develop a creative project that invokes questionings of systems of power and advocating for social change in the Central Valley. So throughout this work, we established our values behind one, showing that the Central Valley has rich roots, history, but also addressing what it means to be displaced on this stolen land. Two, we do this by touching on the effects of racism, colonialism, and capitalism that translates to limitations and opportunity and prosperity in our region that are solely based on unjust structures and that are cruel to oneself and community. Three, difficult to imagine a different reality due to the normalization of abuse and exploitation and injustice in the Central Valley. Also, due to this, our values are inherently based on the abolitionist point of view. And lastly, we seek and ask for our community to imagine a world free from all forms of discrimination, criminalization, violence, so we can focus on empowering, healing, and uplifting one another. So thank you. These are the values that we've held throughout the whole fellowship. And I'll pass it back to Gaspar.
Thank you, Mercedes. Beautiful. Thank you both. And seeing both Cecilia and Mercedes, young, strong women who are part of the struggle. Uh, Dr. Lea Ybarra, can you reflect a little bit about the role of Chicano women in the struggle? What were the main issues then, and what are the main issues that you see now for the
Well,
role
I
of
think,
women in
yeah,
participating in the social transformation?
thank you. I think one of the stereotypes of Mexicanas and other Latino women is that we're, quote, passive. I mean, we used to read all the first articles that say that, they follow everything that the men did. I remember going to, I used to do sessions for doctors and police and so forth. And one of the doctors said, he says, and I talk about how the woman really was the center of the family. So we'll start with that first and we'll go into the politics, the center of the family. And he said, I noticed that. He goes, because I kept asking, I had the husband and the wife there, and I kept asking the husband about, what was this about the family or what issue? And he said he'd turn around and tell his wife, yeah, what do you think this is? And whatever. He goes, so after about 3 times when I'd ask the husband something and he turned to the wife because she had the information, he goes, I started talking to the wife, because the idea was among a lot of people was that we just were passive women. But our history is so, if we understand our history, we understand that from the very beginning, we've had strong women in our culture and in our communities. For example, even from the 1800s, when Doña Josefa Dominguez was going to be shot because she was fighting for independence from Spain, she said it would be an honor to die before these young men to show them what a woman will do for her country. And then we had, of course, las Adelitas that were fighting not only in the support areas of the food, but they were fighting on the front lines as well. I thought it was interesting that, and I'm so glad that we have Kamala Harris as vice president, but it's interesting because she's wonderful, but it's interesting that this country is so proud of having the first woman vice president. When you look at Latin America, and there's been many, many women in many countries that have had leadership roles as presidents of those countries. So the idea that we're passive women is just simply not true. Now, when the Chicano movement first started, I remember certain meetings at the very beginning where, like, literally we're doing the traditional roles of the women were in the kitchen cooking and the guys were in the living room talking, right, philosophizing. And I remember one of the first meetings that happened, some of us stood at the doorway and we thought, we know what they're talking about, we can do that. And so from really almost day one, women became leadership. And in fact, that night they selected a woman as leader of the organization there. So of course, there were always issues and conflicts and sexism and so forth, but women have never, we've never stood back and allowed it to happen. There was always discussions and confrontations, but really the history of you look at an organization like Mecha, and many organizations are led by women and are led by women year after year. So again, I think that the role of our participation is much stronger than people understand outside of our cultures, or that maybe even our own young women understand. And then we look at what's going on today. How many women are in politics that are Latinas, from city councils to governors to the White House, and how many are educators and physicians and doctors and in every field that you can think of. So I think that our role as women, both in the family and in our communities, because I can truly tell you that there was no organization that I'm aware of, whether it was MAPA or Mecha as students or GI Forum or whatever, where women were not an integral part of it and were in leadership roles in it. So I really hope that the young women, particularly today, and certainly the fellows, can realize the importance of our role in our community. Now, one difference I think between us and say the feminist movement, the white feminist movement, was that while white women fought for more equal rights and more equal pay, as Chicanas, we always fought for our communities, for more equal pay, because the men weren't getting any more money either. Then they were treated just as unequally as the women were. So more pay for all our community, better education for all our community. So it wasn't just, we were strong feminists, but it wasn't just an issue that we were what do you call it, fighting for ourselves. We're fighting for our communities. And I think that was a strong feature of the Chicano movement. And I honestly think it still continues to this day. Because even when I hear women fighting for their rights, they're also fighting for the rights of their communities to get better dignity and those kinds of issues that can, and to helping resolve the issues that continue to face us.
Thank you. I'd like to now to explore how do we move forward? How do we move to establish the economic, educational, and political legacy that our communities need to continue to build a better future for our communities based on this rich history of the Chicano movement?
Well, let me mention one of the things that the other night I was looking at something, well, not the other night, a few weeks ago, at a documentary, and African Americans were talking about how when they were first in this country, they said they were not able to achieve an economic legacy or generational legacy, because they said even when they were freed as slaves, that he says we had to build our own restaurants, our own stores, our own doctors, everything. He says because it was still segregated despite the fact that we had been freed. So they built huge communities. What happened though was that as soon as there was a successful Black community that was established, back then the Ku Klux Klan and all those, he said, literally burned down whole towns. And he said, and so we were never able to maintain how you have now in the majority, in the white communities where they pass down wealth. He says, because every time we're trying to establish wealth in our communities, they would burn it down, or they would lynch the person that was doing it. So it was those atrocities that I think started me thinking about that's true. And so I remember reading, I do want to mention one book that sort of brought me to what our legacy was, and that's Occupied America. Let me just show it like this. It was the first book. We used to fight, it was one of the first books that came out on Chicano history. When we first started teaching Chicano studies, it was like no books hardly around. And we had to mail, do handouts. And now there's thousands of books on Chicanos, written by Chicanos on every aspect that you can think of. So I remember reading Occupied America, and Rudy talks about the fact that what happened in South Texas, because I was born in Texas and I was raised in California. So he talks about how the ranchitos that were deeded to us from the Mexican government for many centuries. I mean, my family has been in the US for many centuries. We're the kind that say we didn't cross the border crossed us, because we were literally living along the Rio Grande River for generations. And what happened though, so Rudy talks about how the people would come in, because at that point, anybody could say, oh, this is my land. And, even if they didn't have a grand deed, and they would take it to court. Well, in court, then the judge would give the land to the Anglo-American and not to the Mexicanos, even though they had the deed for it. And then, as wonderful Chicano historians have done work, they found out that in looking at those records, that after this was done, they would then have the judge and the lawyer who was representing the Anglo-American would divide the property. And so that was our educational legacy. So I remember asking one day my mom, I said, Mom, do you remember anything like this happening? And she said, it happened to us. She says, we had a rancho. She goes, we had horses and cows. She goes, I remember the lawyers coming in. They took all the horses, they took all the cows. She goes, and all we were left with was a little plot of land that our house stood at. And I said, well, did anybody fight back? And she says, oh yeah, she goes, but the Texas Rangers at that point supported the ranchers. They didn't support the Mexicanos. Again, the issue of law enforcement, right? And how laws are done to our community. But anyway, she says that there was a family, the Cavazos, she goes, they had like 6 or 7 sons. She goes, they were fighting back to maintain their land, and they killed all of them. And then they dumped them in their bodies in the Rio Grande River, because literally the Rio Grande was in our backyard. And so that the bodies would float down the river, so that all the Mexicanos would know what would happen to them if they fought against these kinds of things. So I thought, just the way the Blacks had their towns burned down, and I thought that's what happened to our people. We had, even look at California. One of the Mexican land grants was all the fig garden. All of that was lost. And so I'm really focused now on the fact that we need to build up that economic legacy. There's millions of us more now in this country than in the 60s. There's a lot more educated ones here. We can educate even more in our community so that we can start even the issue of buying a home. How many people rent for years and probably pay more in rent than they do if they were to buy a home and pay a mortgage? All that is an economic legacy. And I'm really focused on that because I think when you have an economic legacy like that, that you can build and you can leave to your children and they can make it grow and, you know, give it to their children, that increases, when you have a strong economic foundation, that increases a political influence that you have, and it certainly increases the better education that you can give to your children and the betterment that we can have in our communities. So I think that even though we've made a tremendous amount of progress, I mean, all my doctors and my family's doctors are Mexicanos now, Mexican Americans, or Latinos of some group. And so we have made a lot of progress. I see it every day. Fresno State is, I think, more than half Mexicano now. UC Berkeley, when I was a student there was a handful of us, literally a handful of us. Now I think half the entering class is Latino. So we can't ignore the progress, but we also, I think, need to see that there's so much more work that needs to be done. And I think building an economic legacy in our communities and tying that into everything else, I think is really important. You know, I always tell my students in my classes that I said, there's no shame in being comfortable and having a nice home and having a nice car, because that's what our parents worked hard for us to do that. But the shame comes when we forget that others don't have the same thing and that we don't work for them to be able to have the same things that we do. That's where the shame is. You know, it's like this educator Horace Mann stated, and I'm sure you've probably heard of him, but he said, we should be ashamed to die before we have made a contribution to humanity. I think that's the task of every generation, to leave our communities better than how we found them. So I would assume that, like the new fellows graduating today, the young people in their generation will certainly, hopefully, take that to heart and work toward improving on what we've done and leaving a better place for the next generation.
Thank you, Dr. Ybarra. Now, I would like to invite the fellows to pose questions to you. So I'd like to call first, I think we agree with that Ariana was going to go first. So go ahead, Ariana.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Ybarra, for sharing your beautiful experience with us. The first question I have for you today is, how do higher educational institutions, such as universities, hinder the efforts of the Chicanx movement?
Well, I think there's always, like I said, a struggle, right? To make sure that you have relevant curriculum and relevant professors and so forth. But I really think that they hinder it only as long as we allow them to do that. I think that during the Chicano movement, for example, one of the demands was more relevant, professors of color, and programs. So they created La Raza studies and Chicano studies and ethnic studies and programs like EOP and Upward Bound that started bringing in that whole group of students to then really populate our universities. So I think that, yes, there are always going to be obstacles there because people in power don't want to give up power. But you do have the opportunity as students, because I think change has always come from younger people. And you have the power as students to try to not say, okay, well, we're comfortable now, I'm here, so who cares about everybody else, but to say, okay, I'm here, but how can we make others come in here? So I would, I guess, ask the question, not how do they hinder us, but what can we do as students and as a community to make sure that they don't hinder other, our other students to come in. Because the struggle is always going to be there, the obstacles are always going to be there. That's not changing. But what is changing is the power that we as individuals have in making a difference in whatever situation we're in.
Thank you.
I hope that answers the question. I don't know.
Thank you, Dr. Ybarra. And I'm going to popcorn it to Cecilia for the next question.
Thank you for the question.
I do have a question for you. I'm just bringing it up right now. Sorry,
Okay.
My computer's been a little slow today. How has the meaning of being Chicano, Chicana, Chicanx changed over the years?
You know, I was reading this article recently, how they said Blacks have primarily stayed with Black and African American. Latinos have used, oh my God, they say, why do we change our name so much? It was Hispanic, Latino, Mexican American, Chicano, Latinx, Chicano. Now the first time I saw it today on the questions, I think Chicano spelled with an X at the beginning and X at the end. So, I think the names change depending on what that generation relates to. That's one thing. The issues is what I'm more concerned about. It really doesn't matter to me. I mean, the name is a debate that will never be settled because everyone's got their own views, right? Everyone thinks we can do this or should do that. My view is don't focus on the name as much as on the action. What are you doing, whatever you call yourself, to make a difference in our community? What is your action plan? So that to me is something more important. And I think that even though the names keep changing, I think the action plans don't. I think people are still concerned about all those. There are new issues that they're more concerned about now. Like in our case, it was the Vietnam War and getting, the young Chicanos home and everybody else. Now the environment has become a crucial issue. And while people think, oh, that's a white thing, no, it's not. Where are the toxic dumps placed? In our communities? Where are the freeways placed? In our communities? Where is the air most polluted? In our communities? So I think that while issues change, I think the impetus of young people to have the energy to make a difference, that doesn't change. So again, I think rather than focusing on the changes in names, I would say that even though names have changed over time, and some people relate to one thing. I mean, I relate to Chicano, I probably won't relate to Latinx. You will relate to Latinx perhaps and not relate to Chicano. It's, it's okay. It's okay. But people, how they want to self-identify is not the major issue. To me, there's so many critical things that we have to talk about and that we have to work on, whether it's, like I said, our environment, our communities, education, whatever, that honestly, to get bogged down in education on names, to me is missing, missing the forest for the trees or the way around, missing the major issues that we have to focus in. So people, I think, can call themselves what they want, what they relate to, that's okay. But let's not ever lose sight of what the issues are that join all of us together.
Thank you so much for answering that. We do have another question for you.
Okay.
Where'd it go? Sorry. The next one is, what advice do you have for Chicanic students aspiring to go into academia?
You know what? I'm so glad you asked that because honestly, when I was a student at Berkeley, getting the PhD, well, first of all, let's say the students can only aspire to what they see, right? So when I was at a freshman at Fresno State, I mean, my story is so similar to so many thousands of other Chicanos. My counselor told me that I shouldn't go to a four-year college. I should go to a two-year college because even though I was getting A's in honor classes in high school, I would not make it in college. Of course, I didn't listen to them, so I went. And then I think that when I went to Berkeley, then I saw what getting a PhD was, and it became something that I could aspire to. At that point, the Ford Foundation, headed by Arturo Madrid, headed this program. He's a wonderful professor as well. And he, I think half the Chicano PhDs in the country were supported by the Ford Foundation. So I thought, we had this large cohort of Chicanos coming in, and I thought, there's going to be even bigger behind me. Well, there wasn't. There's only like 2%, I think, of professors now PhDs are Chicano, or Latino. It's actually Spanish surname that they use because that way it encompasses all the groups. So I think that it'd be so important for us to be able to inspire another generation to come in PhDs in every field that there is, whether it's, teaching medicine, like at Hopkins, teaching sociology, history, every field, business that you can think of, because we really do need those role models to continue. Because my generation retired started 5, 6, 7 years ago. We have another generation now, they're going to be retiring soon. So it's really incumbent on us to make certain that we don't lose the gains that we made by being a part of the university and making certain that we have relevant curriculum, professors of color that understand what needs to be done and understand the needs of the community and of our students. So I really, implore students to think about getting the PhD. I've talked to students that have gone 2 or 3 master's degrees, and I said, you could have gotten a PhD by now. Get your master's, then get your doctorate, and then do that. I was hired a few years back. UC Riverside had a program because there was like 12. I was given 12 Chicanos who were working on PhDs for years but hadn't finished them. Luckily, we were able to get all 12 of them through with their PhD. So I wish there were more programs like that, because I'm offering my services free. If anybody wants to get a doctorate in any field, let me know. Certainly, those of us that have gone through this know the process. Why reinvent the wheel, right, when you've got resources like us and around. So again, anybody that wants to talk about going to academia, I think it's critical, not only at the professor level, but the staff level too. Running the EOP programs, running all the programs that we've got in those campuses are equally critical. So I really think that it's incumbent on all of us to try to increase that pool.
Thank you. Are there any more questions from the fellows?
Yes, there's one more question. Hello.
Hi.
So, what growth can come from youth moving away from the Chicanx identity to be more inclusive of other community members, such as Centroamericanos and the Black community?
Well, you know what, that was part of my little presentation. I'm so glad you asked that too, because I didn't get to it because I know there's so much to talk about. But one of the things I had put down on my notes, and one of the things I wanted to talk about is that one of the differences between the Chicano movement and now is that predominantly the Chicano movement was primarily Mexican. Even though there were some Latinos there, the majority was Mexican. Now, even though now the majority of Latinos in this country are Mexican, you have a tremendous growth in the number of Central Americans from other countries in Latin America and so forth. So I think it's really critical that we sort of open our eyes to that. Okay, so being in Texas and in California, my sense of the world was Mexican, right? Because that's what I am. When I moved to Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, I realized, my God, Puerto Ricans in the school that I put my children in, there was Puerto Ricanos, a Cubana, Central American, as you know, El Salvador. I mean, there was like 5 different. There was only 5 of us because it was a Catholic school in Baltimore, and the Latino community hadn't started growing yet, although now it's huge. But there was all these groups, and I was telling somebody, I felt so enriched by knowing other Latinos from other cultures and other communities. So I think absolutely there's no way that we can separate ourselves. We don't speak with one voice, obviously. The last election showed that. You know, Cubanos voted more for Trump, Mexicanos voted, and Puerto Ricans voted more for Biden. Central Americans were in the middle. And so we don't speak with one voice, but we certainly have a common identity and wish for our families to do better. And so I really think, in fact, if I don't, hope this doesn't sound self-serving, but I wanted to show this book, Latinos, it's Americanos, Latino Life in the US. And this is the book that was made by Edward James Olmos and I and Manny Monterrey. And we literally got 30 photographers to go across the country and to show the Latinos in all their jobs, from medical doctors and astronauts. And by the way, the women that we show here are astronauts and medical doctors, to the ones that shell clams in Washington State or pick grapes in the Valley, because we wanted to see that. And all the colors too. We're Black, we're white, we're Asian, we're brown, we're indigenous, because we have that diversity. But I think that it enriches us all to know about other groups within the Latino community, and also then to work together to find ways and common ground and common struggles that we can work together on. There's no way that we should not be doing that. I think the last election proved it, because I think in Arizona and in Colorado and in some of the other states, the Mexicano vote, or I'm sorry, I keep saying Mexicano, but the Mexicano and Latino vote made the difference in getting Biden elected. So we are a strong political voice. We just need to make certain that we stand together in all these issues, because it certainly enriches us all culturally and intellectually. And I wanted to mention, when, if I could just say one thing, I was actually hitting on that topic that you were talking about. Again, I didn't have a chance to go through it all, but because I had brought this book to say that when I was talking about the Latino experience and all the books that had come out about Chicanos, I said there's also some great books that have come out about other countries. This is one, In the Time of the Butterflies by Julia Alvarez. And if any of you haven't heard it, please pick it up. It's about the Dominican Republic and when Trujillo was a dictator, and 4 sisters, 3 of which were murdered because they were fighting for freedom, and they were called Las Mariposas. And there is a film that was made on this. And so again, I so thank you for your question, because that was one area about the Latino experience that I wanted to mention in general, and all the different groups that were coming in, that I think books like this are there for us to read and to enrich ourselves with. So thank you again for the question.
Thank you, Dr. Ybarra. Are there any more questions from the fellows before we entertain some questions from the audience? And I'm
That
gonna
was
ask
the last of the fellow questions.
Thank you, Ariana. So can I ask the chat managers to help me maybe summarize the questions or from the Q&A and the chat? Minerva,
Yeah.
can you help with that?
Oh,
Or Cecilia, sorry.
Yeah, I offered to do this portion of going through the chat for the questions. Let's see. The first one that I do see on here is from Vicky. What is your take on Afro-American and Hispanic history in regards to slavery and agriculture workers? Is it not one and the same?
I'm sorry, what is could you repeat it?
Yeah, no, I'm so sorry. What is your take on Afro-American and Hispanic history in regards to slavery and agriculture workers? Is it not one and the same? It's from Vicky.
I don't know if I truly understand the question, but let me try to answer it. If farm labor and slavery are one and the same, yeah, in a lot of ways they are, because in fact, one of the things, first, let me do a positive point. One of the positive points is that the Mexican government, with all its faults, right, a long time ago, told when the African Americans got their freedom, they said any African American that is able to cross into Mexico will be free, because Mexico didn't have slaves of African Americans, and so many of them cross. So you go areas like Veracruz and all of that. There's a big African American, well, not African American, African population there that are now Mexicanos, because their ancestors crossed at that time. Now, in terms of slavery and farm workers, yeah, when you look at the fact that slaves, they were not paid for their labor, right, and they were mistreated. The same thing happens to farm workers. I mean, there's been so many incidents. Certainly, when there was a thing that was being done here that finally somebody went to court and fought it, was that the farmers in the area and in many other states too, where there were farm workers, would have the farm workers pay, knowing that they were undocumented. They'd have them work all month long, and at the end, instead of paying them, they would call immigration to get them deported. So was that slavery? Absolutely, that's slavery. And when you had people working out in the fields like farm workers before the United Farm Workers came in, that didn't have bathrooms, that didn't have water, that didn't have any of those kinds of facilities that any other worker in this country would have, yes, that is slavery. Even today, if they're under union contract, they're paid pennies on it. I remember as a kid working in the fields and picking grapes and picking cotton, and you would get a nickel sometimes. And by the way, that's another point too. That's an issue with slavery. They didn't care about children. Even though we have all these laws against child slavery, I tell people, I don't remember one person ever coming in and from the government and saying that child shouldn't be working here. They should be, they're too young. That was never done. So yes, it's a very painful but very true question that in fact a lot of farm workers are treated as slaves, and without the United Farm Workers it would be even worse now. But luckily there are some changes being made. But I hope I answered the question.
Thank you on that one. Our next question is from Mirna. What roles does arts play in the Chicano movement?
Well, you know what, if I had more time to do my background, I actually have a lot of posters on Chicano art that say that. I think it's critical. The murals are very